Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Parrish, the Managing Director of Cortexa. We're an e-learning business based in rural Northamptonshire. And today I'm here really to talk about some fairly interesting times over the last few weeks. We are, as I say, a digital training communications business. We've been around just about 20 years. We're a bespoke LMS developer. We also create an awful lot of custom e-learning content, primarily in the private sector. We operate about 57 different learning sites, and there are 14 of us based out of Great Toddington, Northamptonshire. I think that's as much as I want to say about us at the moment. Happy to cover some of that later if you want to know more about what we do. When I was first invited to talk on this event, and it was probably just before Christmas, we first started to moot it and then sort of firmed it up in February. I had a view in mind what I might be talking about today. So I thought, well, we'll talk about the business, we'll talk about what e-learning is and where it's heading and what's good and what's bad. Talk a little bit about the gamification stuff and the importance of engagement, and then do a little pitch on LMS. And then something happened. 23rd of March was lockdown day. Probably 10 days, 12 days before that, we started to hear a lot of noise about what was going on. But the initial reaction of the bulk of our customers was something like this. Basically, communication stopped in our space with our customers, and they were waiting, and it soon turned to wondering. So, how are we going to get through this? What's going to happen? And we found there was lots of people talking to each other in the last couple of weeks of March, very beginning of April, but not an awful lot going on. And then from the 7th, around the 5th, 6th of April onwards, things started to move. And I identified 3 waves of how things have been impacted and where we've engaged with our customers. And I just want to talk through those, and particularly the 3rd wave, which is just starting now, has some interesting portents for the future. So wave 1 is really about how are people going to cope working from home. There was this, work from home if you can, and people had perhaps done the odd work from home day, but generally organisations weren't geared up to have large numbers of people working from home or remote working. And the forward-thinking ones started to take steps 2nd week of March, but from the 23rd onwards, it really became a big issue. And the first thing we were asked was to provide support on how people are going to work from home. So we did a whole series of free e-learning modules going to our core customers around remote working, about effective video calls, and some social stuff about how to support each other when people are working from home and are remote. We also did stuff, as I say, about hints and tips on things like effective video calls, and that was probably one of our most popular pieces. Went out to about 60 organisations, and we got an awful lot of completions on those. So that first wave was, how are we going to get people working if they're not working here? And that was really the first 2-3 weeks of April, towards the end of April. We then got into the 2nd wave, and for me, the 2nd wave split into 2 distinct pieces. First of all, people wanted to know that, okay, if we're going to start operating, and this is sort of talking late April, beginning of May, operating in COVID-19 conditions. So we're going to have new operating procedures, new systems, whether that's tied up with the remote working or when we're starting to come back into the workplace. Particularly our manufacturing customers, we're talking about, yes, we can take down floors, we can put up perspex screens, but how do we educate our employees on how to behave well and how to work in this new environment? The second part of wave 2 was how do we train and keep engaged with these huge numbers of furloughed staff? it was initially, the first reaction we felt were people would think, well, they're furloughed, they're gone. And then within a few days, it was then, okay, so how are we going to keep in touch with them? And there was a big focus then on providing training. And we've done quite a lot of moved quite quickly to try and get systems available for people to do educational, to do training at home. And that keeping contact with furloughed staff was an important part of that. And content started to proliferate. Everybody and his dog seemed to be producing content on how to stay safe in the COVID-19 environment. There was an awful lot of stuff was going through social media, was going through learning management systems, was being delivered on company intranets. There were PDFs, there were videos. There was a huge proliferation of content. And it was pretty generic. So people like us, we have a fairly strong affiliation with the construction industry and construction industry supply chain. So then we started getting involved in more custom stuff, and things like animations, where we were trying to educate people in a very specific environment. This was about the merchant environment. This is a piece that we've used in an e-learning piece so this is all about understanding how people are going to work in this new COVID-19 scenario. And so the information gradually started to become less generic, more useful. And we spent the best part of May starting to putting this sort of material together. Not least, learning how to use the technology better. The technology has moved relatively quick, well, very quickly in the last few weeks. And Microsoft seemed to be adding elements to Teams almost on a weekly basis now. People obviously using Zoom. Zoom almost become a generic word in people's language about Zooming other people. So we did some courses, we've done a couple of courses on how to use the tech better. We also have produced content for the furlough. We already had a site, a generic site with a lot of product and technical training on it. I was asked about a particular piece of work we did, or we've done with Travis Perkins, a Northamptonshire-based company. Travis Perkins wanted to get their product and technical training specifically out to their employees who are on furlough, and particularly apprentices who are sitting at home looking for stuff to do. And they were already a part of the Builders Merchants Federation, so they had access to some of that content, but they wanted a custom experience. So we fast-tracked a piece of work for them that we'd started talking to them about in December, but it just happened very rapidly through April and the beginning of May to put together a specific site for them to deliver product and technical training to their apprentices and their employees to get certifications while they were on that furlough time. And this site started operating back end of April, and a good number of apprentices and employees have been accessing product and technical training through that site. So the two elements of what I was calling the second wave was, how do we operate in this COVID-19 environment? And the second wave was, how do we keep in touch, and how do we utilize that time with our furloughed employees, giving them something to do, but keeping them engaged with the organization and taking the chance to upskill them. So we've done huge amounts of training during that critical period. So period 23rd of March through to the 12th of May, which was our classic sort of wave 2 period. We delivered about 4,000 courses. So the BMF building blocks were those 4 programs on the Travis Perkins site. They're 10, 12-hour programs with an accreditation. There was other short training pieces, product-specific stuff that we'd put into our environment from suppliers, that's building materials manufacturers. But we also delivered a lot of skills and compliance training. So people are wanting to be positive in the way they were spending their furlough time. So we did a lot of Excel and Microsoft training, interpersonal skills, sales skills, those sorts of stuff. So that volume of training has gone, and we're over the peak of that as people are starting to come back from furlough, and some coming back from furlough on a part-time basis. So that brings us to what I'm calling wave 3, and this is probably the most interesting part for me anyway. And it's that point at which the organisations that we interact with are starting to realise that things are not going to be the same again. It's going to take a long time for people to come back from remote working. The social distancing rules, even if it goes down to a metre, is still going to be driving the way organisations set up their operations and how they serve their customers. And we don't know how long that's going to be for. So trying to plan and trying to organise on a timescale which is pretty unknown is very difficult. And so this phrase, the new normal, has grown and proliferated. And understanding what that new normal is part of where we're working now with our customers to build systems and infrastructure that will help them to operate in the future. So why do we talk about new normal rather than back to normal? Well, I think for many organisations, remote working seems to have gone better than they expected. They've dispersed, they've got people operating from home, and it's actually worked quite well. I personally had some experience with the civil service early in the lockdown period. They moved to remote working very quickly, and to be honest, it was a pretty seamless experience. And that, I think, took, certainly from our perspective, we're hearing it took people by surprise. The second element is that there have been fairly significant social and environmental benefits. This remote working has taken traffic off the road. People are not spending 16, 20, 30 hours a week commuting. So their time in their home offices, working from home, wherever they're working from, is more productive. And that, in turn, has had big impact on the environment. So it raises this question: have we glimpsed the future? So is this new normal here to stay? And if it is, how do we then gear up to meet those meet the demands of it? And those of you on LinkedIn may have come across an article by the Chief Information Officer at Wilmot Dixon, Alan Ramsey, who wrote a very good blog post on what he calls post-presenteeism, and how moving on from the problems we had with presenteeism 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, it's now acceptable for people to take working from home, people working in a much more flexible way, and using technology to support that. The idea of people participating in a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting from site, in our world, the construction industry, back to the head office, is pretty new and pretty radical. So those sorts of changes are being driven fairly hard. The technology is moving faster than ever. I mentioned the changes with Teams, with virtual reality. Great to see Northamptonshire Council getting involved at parish level with virtual reality headsets and those sort of meetings. And people are learning to use the tech. When we first started delivering e-learning over the internet 15 years ago, I commonly came up against a resistance from senior managers saying, well, I've got people who don't understand the internet, they don't understand computers. And that resistance is just melted away. People do realise now that accessibility is pretty huge. So what are the challenges, and where does our experience sort of fit in that? Well, the challenges going forward is physical office space may not be required 5 days a week. Certainly, if you take the red shift, blue shift approach of alternating days so you can maintain social distancing, then by definition, the office space is going to be, some of it's going to be redundant. But certainly, may not be required 5 days a week. Having said that, people still crave social interaction, and I think importantly that an in-person interaction as part of their role within organisations. So Zoom meetings, Microsoft Teams meetings can be very effective, but they miss that physical element. We've been inducting a new employee over the last couple of weeks using we recruited and appointed somebody completely remotely. And the hardest part of that whole process has actually been the induction. Being unable to sit next to someone and walk through processes and the way we do things has proved probably the biggest challenge of that whole process. Technology is improving, but still needs to move forward. Internet speeds, bandwidth, the technology itself, virtual reality is still a little bit strange for a lot of people. So the technology still needs to continue to improve. I think one of the hidden sort of challenges is if we're working remotely more extensively, then organisations are going to need different and better controls and performance measures. And there's both business performance measures, but also individual performance measures. The old school controls and KPIs that we had don't apply anymore. So that needs to change and move with the way organisations are beginning to reorganise. There's also the challenge of how we continue to develop people. If they're not there, if they're not into one-to-one coaching sessions, if they're not getting learning with Nelly, people sitting next to them, mentoring them, how do we continue to develop people in an environment where they're only occasionally visible? So that's a big challenge. And certainly from our perspective, we do a lot of work in the extended enterprise. I'll say a little bit more about this in a couple of minutes. But operating in the extended enterprise is now becoming much more difficult. And how systems and how the internet in particular can help businesses reach beyond their boundaries, beyond their walls to the extended part of their enterprise. I'll explain a little bit more about that. So the first reaction, the easy reaction from some of our organisations is, well, why don't I just stick everything on YouTube? Yes, it's one solution, but it's a busy old internet out there. I think as one of the previous speakers were talking about, there is just so much traffic, and it just seems to have multiplied and increased the stress levels as the COVID-19 pandemic has really taken hold. And trying to keep people focused when stuff is broadly accessible on the internet is quite difficult. And there's the old e-learning miracle, from PowerPoint to beautiful online program. The number of times over the years we've had individuals say, well, we've got all our training material here are the PowerPoints, can you produce an e-learning program from that? It's getting people to understand that 99 times out of 100, a PowerPoint has been put together to deliver face-to-face. So creating content which is going to stand out and engage people is always going to be a challenge, and it doesn't usually start with a PowerPoint. We have processes in place to unpick the content of and to work with subject matter experts to be able to create engaging online learning. So what stands out to us is that a good program, an online program, we have to give people time to learn, and there's an art to doing that. The pace with which we work and the pace with which people take in information in their daily lives isn't conducive to embedding new skills and new knowledge. So in the workplace, what we have to do is try and give people a space where they can just slow down a little bit. It's the digital equivalent of people going off on training courses. One of the benefits, I used to do a lot of face-to-face training, and when you do the initial sort of discussions and why I'm here conversations at the beginning of a training session, people would always say, well, it's given me a day off work. It's given me some space to be able to think about me and what I want to do. So a digital learning environment has to be able to do that. So whilst it needs to be entertaining and engaging, at the same time, it needs to be able to take the pace off things so people can stop and start to absorb information. It's also a good program will connect learners to other people on the same program. One of the great benefits of face-to-face learning is you can turn to the person next to you, or you can talk to the tutor and ask questions to reinforce and to check that you've understood key points of a program. So that part of social learning within online programs has moved very quickly over the last 2-3 years. It should be social and fun should be promoted. We try to make things engaging with, we talked about the gamification stuff, we talked about things like badges, so people have some fun gaining new knowledge online. But at the same time, programs should be have a serious outcome, and certification and accreditation is an important part of that. Even in a commercial environment where people aren't chasing a degree program or a diploma program, to have some sort of industry-based accreditation for programs adds a lot of motivation and engagement for people. So we talk about the three E's: engagement, education, entertainment. Entertainment in where people do get a break from their daily lives and they actually enjoy coming to the learning environment. And this cues us into learning management systems evolving to become learning experience platforms. And this LMS becomes LXP discussion. There's a lot of that in the digital learning press at the moment. But LXPs effectively are places where people can add their own experiences. They can access wide ranges of information. They can connect with other learners in groups. It's almost like in a Facebook-like environment. So broadening out LXPs is a way that things are going to be moving forward. We've fast-tracked 3 LXPs during the lockdown for particular groups within the construction industry. Based on, we spun them up on a WordPress platform, and they proved very popular amongst self-employed people within the construction industry. So there's a lot that's happening in that learning management space. I did say one of the most difficult areas of where we operate, we have worked for the last 10 years in the construction industry supply chain, and the manufacturers who sit at the heart of that, these are the people who make the items that go into the building materials supply chain and go into the built environment. They have a challenge of getting new products, new technologies into the supply chain for both their own benefit, but also the benefits of the environment. So things like energy saving products or new, stronger, lighter, better ways of working. Traditionally, and this traditionally means up until about 10 weeks ago, those manufacturers would have teams of representatives who would jump in their cars on a daily basis. They would drive to visit building sites, construction sites. They would build house builders' offices. They'd go to visit specifiers, being architects or consulting engineers, to deliver CPDs, all the time promoting their new products and their new technologies. Since the lockdown and since the social distancing rules, all of that's gone. So they're no longer able to put people on site to deliver CPDs on site in architects' offices. They're unable to visit merchants. They're unable to get onto building sites. Things are controlled enough without bringing manufacturers' representatives on site as well. So they're having to move very quickly to be able to join up their supply chain, their extended enterprise, with their own learning management systems to deliver CPDs and training and product knowledge and product enhancement. We're doing quite a lot of work now in that extended enterprise space, and it brings very different challenges to employee-based learning management systems. And that's primarily around how do you engage people when you don't have the power to tell them to sit down and do it. And when we're not talking about compliance training, we're not talking about induction, onboarding, we're talking about educating them about the way we work in their supply chain. So that's quite a key part of where things are going to change differently for people like us in terms of the services that we provide over the next 5, 6, 12 months. And that's really as much as I wanted to talk about. I'm going to leave it there. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to pick those questions up. Richard, back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. That was really interesting. I think there was one thing you said in there about, I think you said you had a new starter yourself. And I think it's one thing going into lockdown and being online when you've met everybody in your organisation and you've got that relationship. But if you start a new job halfway through this, how do you meet anybody, those relationships that are so easy to build? I'd imagine that would be quite a struggle for someone.
It is, yeah. Alex is the guy we've recruited. We do a weekly team talk on a Monday morning. It's with the Zoom and all the face, and to see his face on that first meeting was it was heartbreaking. He was very. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry.
No. So, I think that's going to be more and more, isn't it, across organisations? Like you say, yeah. Anyone can put things online, put it on YouTube, but to do it well is a totally different skill.
Indeed.
Well, fantastic. We've got a question from Iraq. Dr. Basha from the university in Iraq is asked the question, do you think there is a challenge or conflict between the need for e-learning and the development of technology and internet infrastructure?
It depends. If you take a monolithic sort of view of the phrase e-learning, then yes, there probably is. If you're thinking of structured programs and sort of sitting down and doing a click next type learning journey, then there will be. But I think e-learning is evolving with the technology anyway. So and we've seen a massive change over the last 10 years in the length of typical learning pieces for our customers. It's gone from 45 minutes down to probably 8 minutes as an average sort of learning bite. And it mixes with things like social interactions and community learning. So I'm not sure the technology allows us to do lots of new things, and as long as we reflect that in what we produce, then online learning as opposed to old school e-learning, I think does have a future.
Yeah. I guess with like virtual reality and things like that, there's so much more can be done, but then you've got to have that kit available to be able to take advantage of it. Yes,
and there's also there's a price trade-off. I think it will be quite a while before virtual reality, augmented reality becomes affordable for large-scale organisations to really key into. So we've got to keep one finger on the pulse of where the technology is going, but we have to provide stuff at a reasonable price point for our customers.